Yeah.
Yeah.
Marco has also given me at some point a tip, or like not a tip, but it's like the recommendation to not get an Apple product very close to the running Zoom, because for some reason it could be interfering with each other. And my personal theory is that the Wi-Fi adapters maybe are stronger than the, and just like sexy. Yeah, this is the reason why I never sit here during a fellows brunch with my MacBook. But it should be working. I mean, I think this is.
Hello, Anne, are you there? Hello, Anne. Seems like you're muted if you are there. Anne, it's just you and me at this point. There's other people in the waiting room. Let me know if you're there. You're currently muted. I'm not sure you're hearing me at this moment. Hey, Anne? We have a little bit of difficulty getting Anne's audio going. Hey, Anne, I'm clicking a button that's asking you to turn on your audio. I'm hoping this is not a problem with your new computer that you told me about. Um,
I don't think it's going to be that much. So, yeah, it's-
no. Let's see if, okay, I see your message, and when you logged in, was there an, did it ask you to share your video and your audio? What I'm gonna do right now is, I'm gonna click a button and it's gonna ask you to turn on your sound. Okay, and let me know if you see something. I just clicked it just now. Do you see any invitation to unmute or to turn on your video? Yeah. Okay, but for some reason, you click the unmute button. I wonder if it's an audio issue with your new computer. Because for some reason, you're still marked as being, you're still marked as being muted. Let me see if there's something else I can do on my side. Hold on. So I cannot unmute you. All I can do, Ann, is invite you to unmute. There's no way for me to manually unmute you from this side. Now we see you. We're getting somewhere, but we just can't hear you.
There,
So
now
maybe-
you can hear me, right? You can hear me now?
We can hear you fine. Can you hear us?
And we never.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I think what I'm gonna do now, unless you have any questions, and thanks for joining us.
Sure.
What I'm gonna do is start letting everybody else into the Zoom now that we're up and ready to roll. Is
Okay.
there a show that you want to share, or if not, we don't need to. It's whatever your preference is.
That's fine.
Okay, so you'll just read out your paper or give your presentation? That's good.
Yeah, but I have to get out of full screen form. I didn't print out my paper.
Okay, so what you might want to do is go, are you using a PC or a Mac?
A Mac.
Good. What you can do is go to the top left and maybe for now, hit the little green button. And if you're on full screen, this will slightly minimize it. And then you may be able to find your script behind that. Did that help?
No, but I've got another computer I can read it from. So I'll do
Right.
that.
Sounds great. You think we're ready to let everybody else in?
I think so, yeah.
Right, sounds good. Unfortunately, we only have a few physically in the room today, but we have a lot of people waiting in the wings, so we're gonna let them come streaming in. I think we
All
got
right.
20 so far. Volunteers. All right, well, let's go ahead and start right in. Sorry for the late start, folks. There was a bit of a technical glitch that we have managed to sort through, involving new computers and languages that are not our own, and keyboards that are unaccustomed to the ones I'm using, and all kinds of things. Welcome to the most recent, or the current seminar of the Revelation Reception Network. Thanks everyone for joining us today. As you all know, this is just basically a forum for scholars like you and me and our friends and the people we collaborate with to talk about the work that we're doing in terms of reception of the book of Revelation, its ideas, its images, its figures, its influences, and all manner of scholarly areas of interest. And so what this does today is it brings us to a talk by Ann Matter, and we're very, very happy that she was able to join us today. I'm going to go right into an introduction of Ann so we can get straight to the paper, and then I'm going to hold off on announcements till the end after the paper and after the discussion that no doubt will ensue. Let me move over to my other computer and just simply relate that today I have the high honor of introducing someone who really and truly in our field especially needs no introduction. Ann Matter is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She attained her graduate degrees all at Yale. She was at Oberlin before that, writing her PhD on the De Partu Virginis of Viscasius Radbertus under Yaroslav Pelikan. Over her career, a long and illustrious one, she has taught principally at Penn and has held a wide range of distinguished fellowships and positions. Her areas of teaching and ongoing research in her current status are the history of Christian thought and culture in medieval and early modern Europe, religion and literature, the history of biblical exegesis, spirituality and mysticism, women's history and spirituality, music and Christianity, and the making of critical editions and translations, especially from Latin and Italian. Relevant to our group's own focus today and today's talk, she's widely respected for her work on the Song of Songs in Western medieval Christianity, about which her first monograph of, I think about 8 or 9 now, I'm not sure, was written. And she's also familiar to everyone today, since she has written so many of the books and the articles and appears in so many of the footnotes that other people have written about the late antique and medieval part of the reception story of the book of Revelation. In today's talk, Anne will be bringing together a number of her interests in a talk on the topic, the reception of Revelation and the Song of Songs from the 5th to the 10th centuries. Thank you, Anne, for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to hearing the paper.
Thank you very much, Nathan. You can hear me?
Hear you fine.
Good. And thank you for your patience with my technical issues. I had to get a new computer a week ago, so everything is up in the air. But anyway, here we are down to earth. So let me start. The book of Apocalypse, or the Revelation to John, was among the first biblical texts to be systematically explicated in Latin. Exegesis of the Apocalypse in the early Middle Ages is a complicated story of obscure authors, tangled texts, and at least 2 paradoxes. The first paradox, is the doubtful orthodoxy of the first Latin interpretations, which emerge in the 4th century. And the second is the transformation of the readings of the book of from apocalyptic fervor to an extended allegory of the church. The first thing I would like to do today is to give an overview of the exegesis of the Song of Songs up to the Carolingian age, keeping in focus how each author adapted received materials into new forms in response to the particular concerns of the church of that author's age. After this overview, I will compare this development to another medieval exegetical tradition, the Song of Songs, as unlikely as that may seem, in order to see the connections in the history of interpretation of these two books and to show how early medieval interpretations of the Apocalypse and the Song of Songs are in fact closely related, for reasons which I hope to make clear. The earliest Latin interpretation of the Song of Songs was written by Victorinus of Pettau about the year 300. This commentary set off in a direction repudiated by later Latin exegetes. Nevertheless, in three revised forms, bearing the authority of the noted biblical scholar Jerome, it remained a standard for many centuries. Victorinus seems to have taken his clue from the opening statement that the revelation to John shows, quote, the things that must shortly come to pass, Apocalypse 1:1. Perhaps understandably for one who lived and died in the persecutions of Diocletian, he understood the promises and the threats of the apocalypse as a literal representation of the church in his own age. The interpretation of Victorinus was essentially chiliastic, that is, it looked forward to the 1,000-year reign of Christ as a sign of the end times, a problematic reading for the Christian society of the post-Constantinian world, in which the church grew into a more solid institutional form and developed more complicated, if essentially safer, relationships to the temporal power of the empire. It was therefore Jerome's task to mold the apocalypse exegesis of Victorinus into a form that better reflected a church at peace with the empire, if not always with the world. This he partially accomplished, as later exegetes noted with approval, by changing a literal reading of the text to one with an allegorical framework, suggesting a series of meanings for Victorinus's chiliasm. In the prologue to his revision, for example, Jerome explains that Victorinus's expectation of a 1,000-year reign of Christ as a historical event is a over-literal reading of Apocalypse 20, necessitating a series of corrections. Sorry, I'm struggling with my paper online. There it is, okay. Within this framework of multiple meanings, Jerome was able to save a concept that Victorinus, who was influenced by Tertullian and Irenaeus, not in their theology, not in their exegesis of the apocalypse particularly, but he applied this to the apocalypse in classic form, the theory of recapitulation. As understood through recapitulation, the apocalypse presents a series of typological events recurring in sacred history, from the time of the patriarchs through the unknown future of the church on earth, all the way up to the parousia. For example, for Victorinus, the 7 trumpets of Apocalypse 8 echo from the empire of Babylon into the future, and Antichrist can be seen in the history of the Roman emperors, as well as the one who will come in the last days. Such an approach to the New Testament prophecy, the linking of historical moment to a transcendent purpose, is what Bernard McGinn has called a priori thought. It was this, in turn, that gave later exegetes the freedom to interpret the text in congruence with the specific tribulations of their broadly variant ecclesiastical worlds. The commentary of Victorinus Jerome is significant for the history of the apocalypse exegesis because it opened up some important themes of interpretation and emphasis. An example that shows the complexity of the textual traditions is the interpretation of Revelation 13:18. This calls for wisdom. Let him who has understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666. The Y version of Jerome's text, his first revision, reckons the number of the beast by ascribing Pythagorean number equivalences to the Greek word antimos, meaning contrary to honor, which when broken down letter by letter with numerical equivalences adds up to 666. Jerome's later post-Vulgate redaction of Victorinus instead calculates 666 from the Greek word titan, numerically equivalent to the Latin diklux, the false son, the Antichrist. The later composite recension of Jerome's version of Victorinus conflates the two explanations. Combinations of these explanations are found over and over again in early medieval apocalypse commentaries, often with elaborations bringing the examples up to date. The second source from late antique period of Latin exegesis was the sevenfold interpretation of the apocalypse by Tychonius. A member of the Donatist Church of North Africa, Tychonius presented an obvious cause for suspicion of heterodoxy, just by who he was. Yet Augustine showed a guarded admiration for his exegetical schemes, and his careful response to Tychonius's rules in De Doctrina Christiana ensured that the apocalypse exegesis of Tychonius will be taken seriously. This complicated relationship between Tychonius and Augustine left the two of them intrinsically linked in apocalypse exegesis of the early Middle Ages. Augustine was therefore the obvious antidote for Tychonius, just as Jerome was for Victorinus. A Catholicized version of Tychonius on the Apocalypse shows that the text survived independently as late as the 11th century and may have been used by Jerome in his revision of Victorinus. The direct influence of Tychonius on exegetes in widely diverse early medieval environments, such as Primasius in 6th century North Africa, Caesarius of Arles at the turn of the 6th century in Gaul, Bede in late 7th and early 8th century Northumbria, and Ambrosius Aupertus in the 8th century Lombard of the kingdom of Victorinus were all familiar with this text. Through these intermediaries, Tychonius's themes of apocalypse interpretation, including a clear rejection of chiliasm, the emphasis on the incarnation so characteristic of late antique Christianity, and the theory of recapitulation, expounded within his 7 rules, were used by many medieval authors who probably were not directly aware of Tychonius. For example, Ambrosius Aupertus acknowledges that Primasius put together Tychonius and Augustine into one commentary. Perhaps a decade later, Alcuin, who probably did not know Tychonius, repeats this information verbatim. The commentary of Primasius marks the second stage of early medieval apocalypse exegesis. The later tradition is also indebted to Primasius that it could be argued that he, rather than Victorinus or Tychonius, is the start of the medieval Latin exegesis tradition. Primasius' text on the Apocalypse is essentially a synthesis of the two influential but heterodox exegetes of the 4th century, Victorinus and Tychonius, read, of course, through the lenses of their redactors, Jerome and Augustine. Primasius was the bishop of Hadrumetum in North Africa in the province of Numidia from about 527 to 565. A staunch supporter of Justinian, Primasius lived through both the Byzantine reconquest of the Arian Vandal kingdom in North Africa and the collapse of this imperial enterprise. His role as a Catholic ecclesiastical leader in a tumultuous time and place is at least partially responsible for his interest in the apocalypse. Primasius follows his expurgated sources in presenting a spiritual reading of the text. His prologue explains at some length its relationship to the interpretation of Tychonius and praises Jerome for the insight that, quote, in these single words of the apocalypse lie multiple understandings. All later commentaries were influenced by this one, either directly or indirectly. Finally, the commentary of Primasius, in its interpretation of the apocalypse as a text about the church on earth, shares a concern about orthodoxy with the 4th century redactors of Victorinus and Tychonius, and marks a path for later exegetes. Primasius understands the woman of Apocalypse 12:1, the woman with the moon under her feet and the crown of the sun on her head, as the Virgin Mary, and says that explicitly, and pauses to give a list of heretics, ancient and contemporary, famous and obscure, who misunderstood the incarnation, and therefore the role of the Virgin, including Valentinus, Apollinaris, Nestorius, and Eutyches. This sets the path for the interpretation of the woman with the moon under her feet as the Virgin Mary. Near the end of the treatise, Primasius shows his hand a bit more clearly in an open polemic against the heretics who really presented the greatest challenge to his own church, who of course were the Arians. His interpretation of Apocalypse 22:13, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end, uses number symbolism to show the consubstantiality of the Father and Son and the unity of the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. The letters Alpha and Omega have the same value as the Greek word for dove, peristera, the form in which the Holy Spirit appeared in the baptism of Jesus. Therefore, the Arians, who assert alien natures of the Father and the Son, are refuted by biblical warrant, since the numbers show that all three persons of the Trinity are equal. The importance of Primasius's commentary can also be measured by contrast with the other apocalypse commentaries of the 6th century, those of Apringius of Beja, Cassiodorus, and Caesarius of Arles. The influence of Apringius, who wrote in the Visigothic and Arian kingdom of King Theodas in the part of the Iberian Peninsula that is now Portugal, seems to have been limited to the Iberian Peninsula. As the only later author to cite it is Beatus of Liébana. The Complexiones in Apocalypsin of Cassiodorus also survives in only one manuscript, a 6th century copy. In contrast, the sermons of Caesarius of Arles circulated widely throughout the Middle Ages, but under the name of Augustine. As the specific interpretations of these homilies are drawn from the treatises of Victorinus, Jerome, and Tychonius Augustine, it is difficult to measure their influence on later tradition of apocalypse exegesis because it's very hard to tell which author they're coming from. Nevertheless, it is clear that no apocalypse commentary from the 6th century on was equal of Primasius in the influence on later tradition. All three of the commentaries from the 8th century, the next great flowering of apocalypse exegesis, depend heavily on Primasius, although they also draw directly from earlier commentaries. The interpretation of Beatus of Liébana, probably the latest of the three to be written, quotes lavishly from four of his predecessors, Victorinus Jerome, Tychonius, Primasius, and Apringius, as well as from other sources. The commentary of Beatus is, of course, most famous among 20th and 21st century scholars because of its stunning full-page illustrations in the surviving manuscripts, all from the 10th century or later. In the Middle Ages, however, the text was relatively little known, and it would seem known not at all outside of Spain. Perhaps this is because of the extremely dense character of the commentary, or perhaps because of its extremely topical nature, talking about the church of early medieval Iberia in particular. The commentary of Beatus is divided into 12 books, and the title of each book makes evident the major themes of the treatise: the sanctity of the church, the defense of the divinity of Christ against the adoptionist theology of the followers of Bishop Elipandus of Toledo, for example. As John Williams has pointed out, he's the greatest scholar of the Beatus manuscripts from an art historical point of view. But he does point out that the promises of the triumph of the true church over all enemies may have also struck a comforting note with Beatus, and because of the impending Muslim domination of Christian Spain, although no open reference to Islam can be discerned in the text. At any rate, the particular combination of ecclesiological and Christological exegesis in this treatise is parallel to early Latin exegesis of the Song of Songs. Beatus quotes lengthy passages from the Song of Songs at several key points in his Apocalypse commentary, borrowing from the interpretations in the Moralia of Gregory the Great and the letters of Jerome and the commentary on Luke by Ambrose of Milan. Apocalypse, standard readings of the Song of Songs becomes most clearly visible. Of the exegetes on the Apocalypse up to this point, only the shadowy Victorinus is said to have written on the Song of Songs as well. But from this period on, remarkably, the Apocalypse and the Song of Songs seem to attract the same exegetes. In the period covered by this essay alone, there are extant commentaries on both books, the Apocalypse and the Song of Songs, by Bede in Northumbria, Alcuin in Charlemagne's kingdom, and Haimo of Auxerre in the later Carolingian Empire, while Ambrosius Alpertus is credited with a Song of Songs commentary that does not survive. And he wrote during the Lombard kingdom of Italy, of Benevento. Exegesis of the Song of Songs is thought by most scholars to have started with commentary and homilies on the biblical love poems written in Greek by the 3rd century author Origen of Alexandria, which, like so many of the commentaries we've looked at so far, only survived in another version, the Latin versions of Rufinus and Jerome, except for some fragments of the Greek of Origen in various Greek catenae. The association of the Apocalypse and the Song of Songs then derives from two types of the allegorical exegesis of John Cassian: the ecclesiological mode, what Cassian called allegoria, and the allegorical mode Cassian called anagogia, dealing with the last things of the apocalypse to come. Cassian's categories had become standard tools of monastic exegesis by the 8th century, an assumption that the most mysterious books of the Bible could, and indeed ought to be explained by means of a ready-made hermeneutic. That is, the texts are really about the early story of the church on earth or the end of time, whatever else they may seem to be about, emphasizes the central importance of ecclesiology to medieval biblical scholars. The early Middle Ages in Latin Christianity thus marks a sharp concern for the survival of the church, even to the point of draining the apocalypse of apocalyptic fervor. And there won't be what we think of as apocalyptic commentaries on the apocalypse again until around the 10th century, 11th century, and they come to the front in the 12th and 13th century in authors such as Honorius Augustodunensis, and of course, the later Franciscan apocalyptic commentaries. 8th century commentaries on the apocalypse also mark a turning point in the transmission of sources. Just as Primasius had become a filter for earlier interpretation, so were the commentaries of Bede and Ambrosius Alpertus, which incorporate Primasius and his sources, but become in turn the major sources of apocalypse exegesis for the Carolingian age. The Explanatio Apocalypsis of the Venerable Bede is a sophisticated analysis of the apocalypse, one that carries out a reading of the text as the history of the church on earth, while keeping a watchful eye on the larger picture of cosmic history. In the dedicatory epistle, Bede makes use of the 7 rules of Tychonius to describe the 7 ages of the world reflected in 7 movements of the text. This commentary that follows conforms closely to the scheme. The aspect of Bede's commentary on the Apocalypse that proved most interesting to later medieval exegetes was this working out of the text in accordance with the broad scheme of the church, moving through universal history into sacred time. And it is especially useful of Bede to have left these definitions of time undefined, so that you can put your own world into it. It's not that he says the first end is the 2nd century and then the 4th century. So later apocalyptic exegesis used these 7 divisions and made their own time divisions, putting their own usually into the latest period. Latin Christians of later centuries, reading or commenting on the Apocalypse, had Bede's framework ready to plug into the interpretation of particular events of the life of the church in their own particular worlds. The commentary of Ambrosius Alpertus in contrast provides an example between and 7 Augustine and Primus. A simple source for this commentary is Primasius, who is quoted literally hundreds of times. A study of the sources makes it clear the one motivation for Ambrosius Alpertus was to create a smooth conflation of his sources, yet his own selection of biblical texts, especially from wedding epithalamical writings of the Bible, such as Lamentations and Ephesians, focuses the incarnation and his spiritual marriage with the church. This focus is especially evident in long prologues to books 5 and 9, books that cover Apocalypse 10, 1 to 12, 10:1 to 12:12. For that is from the opening of the 7th seal and the persecution of the woman by the dragon to the binding of the dragon and the rise of the fall of Gog and Magog in Apocalypse 19 to 21. Although the Apocalypse commentaries of Victorinus, Jerome, Tychonius, Augustine, and Primasius still circulated and were even recopied after the 8th century, the particular selections from this earlier tradition compiled and arranged by Bede and Ambrosius Alpertus became the major sources for Carolingian commentary. An excellent example of the weaving together of Bede and Ambrosius Alpertus can be seen in the incomplete Apocalypse commentary of Charlemagne's schoolmaster Alcuin, a text written around the turn of the 9th century. Alcuin begins with Bede's 7 periods, to which he immediately appends, word for word, Ambrosius Alpertus's discussion of the commentaries from the 4th to the 7th century. The Carolingian dependence on Bede is even greater in an anonymous, unpublished question and answer text of the Apocalypse, which may be associated with Alcuin. Here, the questions are all verses from the Apocalypse, answered by selections from Bede's commentary. The 9th century commentary of Haimo of Auxerre is also a conflation of Bede and Ambrosius Alpertus. It is organized in 7 books, showing the influence of the former, but these divisions are adapted from the 10 books of Ambrosius Alpertus. Haimo characterizes the Apocalypse as an intellectual vision about the present and the future church, a vision that can be related to the prayer said daily by Christians, "Thy kingdom come." Haimo's commentary shows clearly the distance between actual apocalyptic expectation and the Latin apocalypse exegesis that had become standard by the 9th century. That the apocalypse was assured to be the allegory of the church is evident throughout Carolingian exegesis, as in an anonymous 9th century Frankish commentary attributed by manuscripts to both Jerome and Isidore, that develops its interpretation by allegorical explication of each group of 7 in the apocalypse, the 7 cups, the 7 seals, etc. As all the apocalypse commentaries from the Carolingian age thus show the continuing assumption of the text as an allegory of the church and a continuing process of filtering specific interpretations from earlier commentaries to support that assumption. There is little in these texts that shares the radical assumption of an imminent and evident apocalypse. Instead, the ecclesiological interpretation is much more visible. Instead, early medieval exegesis presents the apocalypse as a book about the integrity and purity of the church on earth. Tychonius's rejection of chiliasm led to an interpretation of the apocalypse, which understood the book not as a warning of the imminent end of the world, but as a guide for the church on earth and expectation of the final joining of the spiritual and the physical churches. Cashin's term anagogic is perhaps more appropriate than apocalyptic to characterize this literature. Our seminar began last October with Nathan Betz's fascinating analysis of Apocalypse 21, where John sees the holy city, the New Jerusalem, come down to the tabernacle for her marriage to the Lamb. Nathan told us that there were already non-apocalyptic, non-literal interpretations of this pericope in Asia as early as the 2nd century, that is, within a century of the text's existence, and that this interpretation is seen in later commentaries. In fact, Gabriele Zarri has shown us how this motif was instrumental in the descriptions of Bologna from the period of the creation of the 7 churches of Santo Stefano from the 9th to the 12th centuries into the early modern period with legendary material going back to the 5th century. In November, Christian Cardoso showed us how the Greek author Ecumenius, perhaps as early as the 6th century, linked Apocalypse 12, the pregnant woman crowned with the sun with the moon under her feet, to the narrative of the birth of Jesus in Luke 2. Thus, we have already seen how the apocalypse from early Christian times was linked to the marital symbolism of 2 immaculate brides, the Church and the Virgin Mary. The intertwined development of exegesis of the Apocalypse and the Song of Songs shows us how medieval biblical interpretation was deeply guided by theological, political, and symbolic traditions of generations of the Apocalypse. And that shows us that the political and life of the church in each age, as well as the tools they had, the tools coming from the earlier period, were the most important things used by exegetes of the Apocalypse in the later Middle Ages. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this talk, which covered so much material, so many authors, so many approaches, so many angles. It's a bit of a tour de force, and gives us a lot of material to discuss, I am sure. So we turn now in the time that we have about 20 minutes left, and I think we can use almost all of that for question and answer and discussion. It would be great if people would start raising their hands, perhaps using the hand raising icon in the Zoom feature. And in the meantime, if there are not any questions, or as everyone's devising clever and tricky questions, I have a few questions of my own, and I'll start like this.
Great.
This anagogical perspective that we start seeing come to the foreground, kind of as the apocalyptic declines in the anagogic or the mystical arise. I'm just wondering if you could say more about what happens during that time with the individual interpretation of the Song of Songs, particularly vis-a-vis Revelation. Yeah, as we know, Song of Songs has a traditional interpretation according to which it's the relationship of Christ to the individual soul, of Christ to the church. What we see you observing is that the interpretation of Revelation is heading in an ecclesiological direction. We kind of have the interpretation of these books, perhaps, I don't know, going in opposite directions, and yet they obviously appear together in some of these exegesis, like with Beatus, who quotes Longley, or who interweaves Song of Songs into it. So any thoughts about the different directions or trajectories of the interpretations of these two books?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think the first thing to remember is that those 4 levels of exegesis that are carried on throughout the Middle Ages arise in their classical form with John Cassian, that is at the turn of the 5th century. And that is the period in which also the church has already, from the Constantinian age, had to deal with, for a century by that point, the idea of the church not being in the last days, and the fading of an expectation that within our lifetimes we would see the second coming, and making peace with the world, the empire, but also just existence on earth. And I think I put it at one point that the church had to come to terms with a more easy relationship with the empire, if not always with the world. So there's still the already not yet expectation of the end of the world and the fulfillment of an apocalyptic moment. But the reality is that we're still here. And by the 8th century, those tools that Cassian put forward to read the Bible by different ways of understanding it, which for the apocalypse, the book of Revelation, is the most clear version of that the church exists in all of these stories, according to the allegorical, as he called it, reading of the book. And it's interesting, the book of Apocalypse is practically the only book of the New Testament that can be read that way, with these 4 levels: the literal level, then the allegorical or Christological level or ecclesiastical level, then the moral level, which is often the soul. So you get, especially starting in the 12th century, a lot of commentaries about the Song of Songs as the marriage of Christ and the soul, or the apocalypse as the coming of the end of time and the infolding of all souls into the end and into God. And then, of course, the anagogic, or the closest thing to a real apocalyptic understanding that survives into the Central Middle Ages. And so I think that the tools were developed at this period, and also the political and worldly status of the church needed another way of looking at things, especially in this period. And those two things came together very fluently after the 4th century, and by the 8th century were already a set of expectations for reading that you can see very clearly, especially in Song of Songs exegesis, but also, I think, in the lesser apocalyptic readings of the book of Revelation.
Good. Thank you. Just jump in really quick. You mentioned Victorinus as being one of the early commentators pre-4th century who commented both on the book of Revelation and on the Song of Songs. Of course, we've we don't have his commentary on Song of Songs anymore. But another interesting one might be Hippolytus, who falls in that category as well, writing earlier than Victorinus. We
Right.
have him in the Song of Songs, and we know that he's written something called on the Apocalypse of John and the Devil, or I can't remember exactly what it's called. But there seems to be some early joint interest. Origen would be another one who said that he wanted to comment on Revelation in that, and then he commented a lot on Song of Songs. So there is some early interest, but unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to come down to us of
Yes.
these two books.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And my colleague at Penn, Jay Treat, has written about Hippolytus on the Song of Songs quite a lot. And he points this out too, that you can see that idea there, but it's really not until some centuries later that we have actually a commentary on the Song of Songs and a commentary on the Apocalypse that we can compare. But you're right, Nathan, the hints that the same authors were drawn to both books start much earlier, even before Victorinus. And that's interesting in itself too, because when I first saw this happening, as I was working on commentaries on the Song of Songs and got interested in the Apocalypse, it was kind of hard to understand why would people be interested in these two books of all things, because they seem, I mean, the Apocalypse Revelation is very, very theistic, talking about God and in many ways explaining the evidence of God and the plans of God for the future, whereas the Song of Songs never mentions God and never mentions anything specifically about the church, whereas again, the Revelations goes on and on and on about the church even coming down from heaven, like Bologna did in the later medieval period.
All right,
So-
folks, I could keep asking questions forever, but if anyone else wants to jump in with a question, it could be that I'm not seeing your hands. I have my Zoom consultant, Francisca Miller, behind me, who's whispering in my
thank you
ear
for
everything that I know on Zoom. Good. Well, yeah.
Can I add something, since Francisca's sitting right there behind you? Francisca, you also in your paper talked about how the seven horsemen of the apocalypse were understood allegorically or in a symbolic way very early on. So you can see this happening in all kinds of different ways before you actually have the smoking guns I was looking for. That is, people who actually wrote a commentary on each book. And that might be a different kind of investigation altogether, certainly not the kind of very dense, I understand it's very dense, the kind of textual analysis that I like to do. But it's very interesting to see it there so much earlier and all these kind of hints, very intriguing hints.
All right, we have a question from Laura Lieber here in Regensburg. At least I think you're in Regensburg at the moment.
No, I'm still in North Carolina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So great. I actually have a question. I was wondering about sort of the translation and the role of translation in terms of disseminating some of these interpretations. And I'm thinking about this because of the role that the Targums played in Judaism in terms of the Targums of the Song of Songs, and that those were so popular so early on, and that those sort of seem to play a role in tempering some of the messianic expectations, but also the historicizing of the interpretation of the Song of Songs, casting, translating the Song of Songs into sort of the sacred history of Israel.
Yes.
But that the Targum, is so much sort of more popular and seems to be at least as early as the Midrash or Hashirim. So anyway, I just wanted to ask about the role of translation in diffusing some of these.
That's very interesting, of course, because um, the commentaries of Origen, which take prime place in the history of Song of Songs exegesis, are very only known in fragments in Greek, but they're known in these two Latin translations. And we don't really know what happened in the making of those translations, but we do know who Jerome and Rufinus were, so we can make some guesses about what they were interested in. But the Targums it's a very interesting thing to bring up, because Arthur Green has argued that in the history of Song of Songs exegesis in the Jewish tradition, the Midrash Shir HaShirim, the first Midrash on the Song of Songs, was very influential in the way it was going to be read as the love between Israel and God, and the marriage of the people and their God. Although that's in Hebrew, I believe, isn't it? Is that
Yeah.
true? It's in Hebrew, not in Aramaic like the Targums. But so it's an interpretation, not a translation. But I think the other thing to realize about the Latin interpretations, starting with Jerome and the sanitized version of Jerome and Augustine of the earlier treatises of Tychonius and Victorinus, is that everything is in Latin. And we don't get any vernacular medieval interpretations of the Song of Songs until the 12th century, because we hardly get any vernacular European anything until the 12th century. But I mean, the very little of it. But then there is kind of a flurry of interpretations of the Song of Songs in German, in English, in French. There's a French poetic interpretation. But I haven't really looked at them to see how the interpretation changes according to the language. That's a very interesting thing that could be done. Do you have any thoughts about how that works? In particular? I mean, you noticed it, you brought it up. Do you have an answer?
No, I mean, it's always obviously the poetry and how the the issue is always something that's worth looking at, but that would be such a different context that I'd be curious to know, but it's taking me to someone else's specialty. It would be interesting.
Yes, it would be. I think that's a very good thing to put on my bucket list for things to look at next.
And unless there's any more questions, I'm gonna just sneak one in more of my own before I go to some final announcements. And that is, and in your, these later, second half of the first century interpretations, and we get this trend toward the church. Of course, as you pointed out, there's the ethical dimensions to the interpretation of Revelation as well. One thing I've noticed with some of the earlier traditions, and or some of the earlier texts that deal specifically with the idea of the heavenly Jerusalem, is there tends to be this idea of union with God, deification, nuptial union, some kind of consummation with the divine in the eschaton, or even in the present time. But I haven't really looked at any of the Latin texts in the period that you're talking about yet. And I'm just wondering if you see this impulse toward union, which I see in the early Greek interpretations, if you see that also in any of the Latin works, this impulse toward union with the divine, union with God, and that perhaps being a touch point with the Song of Songs.
No, I don't see it in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. of course, in the 12th century and after the 12th century, that becomes a very important part of both exegesis of Revelation and of the Song of Songs. And somebody like Bernard of Clairvaux, his whole focus is on the union of the soul with God. But that would be something, again, to look for explicitly. But it didn't ever jump out at me because the also for the Song of Songs, the ecclesiological interpretation is so dominant. And that I think reflects the world of the church between the 4th and the 9th centuries, kind of getting becoming used to thinking about it as something that is going to stay here. And we have to live in it now and not just, look forward to the end, which will come in our times. All the people I talked about are struggling with the fact that the end doesn't seem to be coming very soon. And we have to do something to make the church survive. Although again, in the 13th century, somebody like Joachim of Fiore sees himself in the last age of the church. And so there's a returning apocalyptic with the Franciscans, who were very invested in apocalyptic thought, of course, later on. But in this period I'm talking about, it's the dominant necessity is to support the church and understand the church in the world, if not of the world, at least it's here.
Excellent. Well, I think at this point, I'm just going to move to a few final announcements about upcoming seminars and events. But I think first we owe Anne a round of applause. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
We hope you keep coming back and remembering each and every one of our contributions. You seem to have quite a memory for this kind of thing. So a few upcoming things in the future for this network. Unfortunately, of course, the session that was supposed to precede Anne's today was canceled, but we have two.
That I really was sorry about that, because he was going to talk about the heavenly Jerusalem in 20th century Protestant theologians. That would be really interesting for me. So I hope that can be rescheduled too.
He and I are talking, just some events came up and it just made it impossible, but he and I will find a time and we'll announce that to the network when he's able. The next talk after this one, everyone, will be our very own Régis Bonnet's seminar, which will be in exactly 2 weeks to the hour, minus 1 hour, because it'll be starting at 5 o'clock local time. He will be joining us here in Regensburg. It will be another hybrid event. And if plans go through, anyway, I won't say anything more about what he may or may not bring, which may or may not be chilled to drink afterwards. And then in roughly a month, on 11th of April, Tobias Nicholas's rescheduled seminar talk on the Bamberg apocalypse will be taking place again as a hybrid event. Links to these and further information will be coming out on our social channels as well as in the email. And so keep those or put those on your calendar. Also, I'm very excited to announce, for those who don't already know, that Elisa Manzo and myself, Elisa I think is on this call, we've had a 2-day session at the Oxford Patristics Conference accepted, and we're going to be talking about the late antique reception of the Book of Revelation for 2 days, for 6 hours. This is going to be
goodness.
So we hope a lot of you guys who are in Oxford can come by and prioritize those sessions. Christian Cardozo is going to be there. Tom Schmidt, they're on this call right now, and Elisa will be presenting. I'll be presenting. Francisca will be presenting. Stage left. And anyway, it's going to be a great time. And yeah. Aside from that, if anyone out there has any news about any books that you're publishing or articles that you've published or that your colleagues have published that touch anything on the reception of Revelation, we would like to start keeping track of that and announcing it to the network and to the world at large. So email, Facebook, Twitter, X, please let either me know, Christian Cardozo or Regis Bonnet via email, or however you would like to communicate, carrier pigeon perhaps. And we will do our best to make the world know about these things. And I think that's about it for now. So thanks everyone for joining. Good to have seen all 32 of you, or I think 33 at one point. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks for the hybrid event with Regis on 666. Have fun.
Wonderful. Thank you.